There is a Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga, which is discussed at length in Chassidus. The place in Chassidus where this Mishnah is analyzed is in the Maamar of the Nedarim, Parshas Matos, which talks about Nedarim. The Mishnah has a Gemara on it, and the Gemara explains the Mishnah. But the Gemara explains the Mishnah in a very technical, halachic way. Chassidus explains the Mishnah from a very, very different spirit. And this is more or less what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says that Torah is divided into three categories. The first category of Torah is called Likutei Torah, which means literally the body of Torah. The second level of Torah is called Hararim Hatluyim B'Shaira. That means mountains hanging by a thread, by a hair. And the third is called Oisios Parches Ba'avir Ve'ein Lahem Al Mashi Yismeich, which means letters floating in the air that have no basis to support them in the Torah at all. What this means is Hashem gave us the Torah. In addition to Hashem giving us the Torah, He gave us the mitzvahs of the Torah. Some of the mitzvahs are written very, very explicitly in the Torah, very elaborately, in great detail. And even though you always need commentary on Torah, but for the most part, the commentary is simply explaining the text. Then there are ideas in Torah which are based on a hint, on a tiny allusion. There'll be a word, there'll be a letter, there'll be a pasuk, which is the basis for a whole series of halachas, where the biblical text provides a very, very, very deficient, a very, very limited basis for what the mitzvah and the halachas that come from this mitzvah are. And most of it is, like the expression is, Harorim Atluyim B'Shaira, mountains linked, anchored to the Torah Shebiksav with a hair, with a tiny little connection. And the third category are Eisias Peches Ba'avid Ve'ein Lahem Al Mashi Yismeich, which means ideas that are part of Torah, that are not written in Torah at all. Like, for example, Halacha L'Meisha Misina. So let us discuss these three categories. What would be examples of things that are discussed in Torah explicitly? Number one, Tzaraas. Tzaraas is discussed in Torah at length. Two whole Parshas, Tazria and Metzora, or at least a Parsha and a half, are dedicated to the halachas of Tzaraas. Nigi Yerbasar, Nigi Begodim, and Nigi Batim. Number two, Karbanos. Karbanos has two whole Parshas, Parshas Vayikra and Parshas Tzav, or at least a Parsha and a half, where every one of the Karbanos is discussed, and you have a most unusual thing about Karbanos that you find no place else in Torah Shebiksav, where in the Chumash itself you have a commentary on the Chumash. In Parshas Vayikra you have the Im'ela Karbanei, the halachas of a mincha, and then the halachas of a shlamim, and then the halachas of a chatos, and an asham, and so on. And then when you get to Parshas Tzav, you have Zois Teiras ha'Eila, Zois Teiras ha'Mincha, Zois Teiras ha'Chata, Zois Teiras ha'Asham, Zois Teiras Zevach ha'Shlamim, where the Torah literally is commenting, is giving commentary on all of the Karbanos details written in Parshas Vayikra. It's a very interesting and the most unusual thing in Chumash, in the Torah Shebiksav. But you have two whole Parshas deal with Karbanos. In general, the laws of Tum and Tahara, the second half of Parshas Metzora talks about Nida, and Balkeri, and Zava, and so on. These mitzvahs, these parts of Torah are very, very clearly and explicitly and in detail spelled out in the Torah. Then you have many, many things in the Torah which are hanging on a hair. For example, Lamites Malachas of Shabbos. You have to keep Shabbos. There's a whole section of Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Shabbos. There are a handful of psukim in the Torah. There's actually quite a few psukim in Torah that talk about keeping Shabbos. But the psukim that speak about keeping Shabbos don't go into the details of keeping Shabbos. They just talk about the idea of resting and not working, and resting and not working, halifying and sanctifying and delighting, But the laws, the Lamites Malachas of Shabbos, are really not very well represented in the Chumash. We learn it, the Gemara says, from Eila Dvarim HaDvarim, the Remez, there's a slight hint that indicates that it's Lamites Malachas of Shabbos. The same is true of Hilchas Tefillin, and even Hilchas Mezuzah. You don't have Hilchas Sefer Torah, you don't have long, involved discussions, Hilchas Shchita. You don't have long discussions on how these mitzvahs are performed. You have an allusion, a reference. And of course, the Rambam writes that Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai with three things: Luches ha'even v'atera v'hamitzvah. He came down with the two tablets, the Luches. He came down with the Sefer Torah, and he came down with the mitzvah. Says the Rambam, what does it mean? And this is the Hakdama Pirush HaMishnayos. What does it mean that Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the mitzvah? It means very simple. Moshe Rabbeinu came down with specific instructions how to make tefillin and how to make mezuzah, and what's a lulav and what's an esrig and what's an hadas and what's arava. They didn't extract it from the psukim. Moshe Rabbeinu was given specific instructions by the Eibishter what tefillin look like, what mezuzah looks like, and what teruma is, and so forth. During the 40 years in the desert, the Jewish people who had the mitzvah and had the Torah dedicated themselves to finding sources in the Torah for the mitzvah. In other words, it's backwards. They didn't take the mitzvahs from the Torah. They had the mitzvahs, halacha l'meisha misinai. Moshe Rabbeinu gave it to them. And they tried to find a link between the halacha, the mitzvahs that they had, halacha l'meisha misinai, and the mikra and the chumash. If they found such a link, we call that a de'eraisa. If no such link was found, we call that halacha l'meisha misinai. There are indications and instances where halacha l'meisha misinai is considered a de'eraisa, because it really is on the same madrega as the de'eraisas, except that they couldn't find psukim for it. And it's so interesting how the Rambam and the Akdama Pirush HaMishnayos actually says how many halachas l'meisha misinai there are. He says there's 32, I think 32 or 31 halachas l'meisha misinai, and that's it. And he holds that these are a few halachas, a handful of halachas, amongst the hundreds and thousands of dinim and mitzvahs, with Moshe Rabbeinu brought down from Har Sinai directly, they couldn't link to the Pesuk. And accordingly, you have these three madregas. You have those things which Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu how to do the mitzvahs, and they're written explicitly in the Chumash, like Karbonis, like Tzaras, like Tumentare, and so on. Then you have those things that the Yidden had the mitzvahs, and they found a tiny allusion, a small reference in a pasuk to those mitzvahs, and they come de'eraises. And then you have things which they could not find the source for it in the Torah, and they remain halacha l'meisha misinai. The example which is brought for this in the Mishnah and in the Maimarim is hatoras nedorim. There's two mitzvahs, hafaras nedorim, which is breaking a vow, and there's hataras nedorim, which is untying a vow. The difference between breaking a vow and untying a vow is, breaking a vow means you're stopping the vow. Untying the vow means you're releasing it retroactively, backwards. And hataras nedorim is eisi, is perches, ba'aver, ve'ein lehem mamashi yismechu. It's not at all written in the Chumash, it's entirely floating in the air. It's halacha l'meisha misinai. It comes from the Eibishter, from Moshe Rabbeinu. But in the Chumash it's not found. And the mitzvahs and the halachas that we have go into these categories. Some are called Gufei Torah, that the Chumash almost can be a Shulchan Aruch when it comes to these mitzvahs. Some are Hararim Atluyim B'Shaira. You can never know how to do the mitzvahs from the Torah itself. The Torah simply has a simple allusion to it, and the rest of the details have to come from an oral tradition. And then you have those things which are not written in the Torah at all. And the Memory Chassidus are asking why. Why are some mitzvahs written in the Torah in such detail, so elaborately, and other mitzvahs are barely written in the Torah? You can learn it from a Vov, and yet still others that are not written in the Torah at all. And the answer is very interesting. Chumash, Mikra, Teiras Moshe, is Teiras HaAtzilus, is the Torah that was learned in Atzilus. The Nevi'im are the Torah that's learned in Bria and Yetzirah. And Ksuvim is lower still. But Chumash, Mikra, is Torah that's learned in Atzilus. Down here we have 613 mitzvahs. In Atzilus they also have 613 mitzvahs. But in Atzilus, the center, the preoccupation of Torah and mitzvahs is quite different than the center and the preoccupation of Torah and mitzvahs as they are down here. Because Atzilus is a godly world and this is a mundane world, a physical world. So when you're looking in the Chumash and you're wondering why certain things are written in such detail and other things are barely mentioned and still other things are not mentioned at all, is because you're looking at God's wisdom through Atzilus spectacles, through an Atzilus set of glasses. You're looking at it through an Atzilus prism. And from the perspective of Atzilus, these are the most important mitzvahs, Karbones, Tum and Tare, Kachim and Tahares, as opposed to, let's say, Noshim and Nezikin, for example. And therefore, from a perspective of Atzilus, these parts of Torah and mitzvahs take up most of the conversation because they're the preeminent Atzilus priority. And other parts of Torah and mitzvahs, they're all there because in every world you have the whole Torah and mitzvahs, but they are, so to speak, less central, and therefore they're represented by a few words or by a single word, and in some cases they're not represented by anything at all. Now, for purposes of full disclosure, I would like to point out that when you say that Torah Smeisha, Chumash, Mikra, Torah Shebeksav is Torah Sa'atzilus, and that the reason some parts of Torah are so well discussed in the Chumash, and other parts of Torah are barely mentioned, because you're learning in a Chumash, Mikra, without the help of Mishnah and Talmud and Kabbalah, is learning Torah as it is in Atzilus alone, and in Atzilus alone, that's how the Torah should look. When you say that Chumash is Torah Sa'atzilus, it's to the exclusion of two things. It's to the exclusion of the worlds lower than Atzilus, but it's also to the exclusion of those worlds that are higher than Atzilus. And both of those things come into play in this conversation. When you say that there are harorim atluyim b'shayda, that there are many, many areas of Torah that are mountains hanging on a string, like Hilchot Shchita, for example. It's because, on the one hand, Hilchot Shchita is lower than Atzilus, and therefore in Atzilus it's merely a hint or a trace. But it's equally and simultaneously true that the Hilchot Shchita are rooted in Kesed, based on the principle that Divrei Seifrim have a higher source than Divrei Torah. The oral Torah, which the Chachamim revealed through Chochmah, has a higher source than the Mikra and the Torah Shebeksav. And the same is also true with Hataras Nedarim. That's how the Maamarim explain it. Hataras Nedarim is higher than Afaras Nedarim. Releasing a vow, untying a vow is Chochmah. Breaking a vow, interrupting a vow is Bina. So in Chumash you have a whole Parsha about Afaras Nedarim, a whole section is about breaking a vow. Hataras Nedarim is Eisias Perchetz Ba'avev Eino Mashi Yismeichu. It's not in the Chumash. On the one hand because it's lower than Atzilus, but on the other hand because it's higher than Atzilus. So when you look at the Torah, and you sort of accept that premise, that you're looking at Torah Sa'atzilus, and you see certain things explained very well, and other things barely mentioned, and other things still not mentioned at all, and they're entirely in oral tradition, it's because some things are Atzilus-centric as opposed to what is above and as opposed to what is below. Other things are not Atzilus, they're lower than Atzilus and have a source higher than Atzilus. And depending on how low they are and how high their source is, they're either written in the Torah Beremez or they're not written in the Torah at all. Now, why am I giving you this entire introduction? I'm giving you this introduction because we're learning a Maamar about Tzaraas. Now, you may wonder, why am I learning a Maamar about Tzaraas in Parshas Shmini? And the answer is because I intend, B'li Neder, to start, I want to learn V'nigdashti, a Maamar from Parshas Emer, which is going to take us quite a while, probably take us till Shavuos or beyond. So I'm permitting myself this week to learn this Tzaraas Maamar, even though it's Parshas Emer, pardon me, Shmini, but this year it's one of those Shmini, Shmeina, Shmeinas. We're reading Shmini now for the third week in a row. So I'm permitting myself to do the Maamar of Tazria early, and Liadi, with Hashem's help, next week we're going to begin the Maamar V'Nigdashti, and we're going to learn with Hashem's help all of it. Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach. This is a Maamar on Tzaraas. I don't think there's anything in the Torah that's explained as detailed as Tzaraas. It's probably even more detailed than the laws of Karbonis. And what's strange about it is it's totally irrelevant. It's completely theoretical. And we don't know what it is. We don't understand it. We don't know how long it existed and how widespread it was. The whole thing to us is so enigmatic. It's so weird. It's so strange. It's like you have two whole sections in the Torah that deal with material that's completely hypothetical. Karbonis, at least the times of the Beis HaMikdash, were Maaseh b'chol yom, people were Karbonis. But Tzaraas almost never happens. Even in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, Nigei Batim was a very unusual, obscure event and so forth. And yet the Torah dedicates 2 parashas to the halachos of Tzaraas. And you scratch your head and you wonder, why is the Torah wasting so much time with something which nobody understands, no one knows what it is, and what is the significance of it, and so forth and so on. And the answer is, the reason we cannot relate to Tzaraas is we don't live in Atzilus. If we lived in Atzilus, the disease of Tzaraas, and more importantly, the spirit and the meaning behind Tzaraas, would make more sense than anything else. And accordingly, the Torah dedicates so much time and effort and energy and detail to the mitzvahs and halachas of Tzaraas. And let's generalize for a moment. Tzaraas is halachas of tum and tara, of cleanliness and uncleanliness, ritually speaking, spiritual purity and impurity, taras. We have Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, 6 orders of Mishnah. Zroyim, which deals with agriculture. Moyed, which deals with time and Yom Tevim. Noshim, which deals with marital issues. Nezikim, which deals with business law. Kachim, which deals basically with Karbonis and the Beis HaMikdash. And Taris, which deal with purity and impurity. When you look at these 6 orders of Mishnah, and you ask yourself which of these 6 orders of Mishnah is the most logical, and which of these 6 orders of Mishnah is the least logical. So the answer by Pashtus has to be the most logical order of Mishnah is Nezikim, is business law. And the least logical area of Mishnah is Kachim, is Karbonis. Why? Business law is so down to earth. A non-Jew has business law. Moreover, so much of the laws of jurisprudence in many civilizations are based on Talmud, are based on Nezikim as they're found in the Shas. Because the laws of business and neighbors and responsibility from a person to a person and so forth and so on, which is written in the Torah, are so logical, they make sense to a goy and it can apply to all of humanity, to all times and all places and so forth. Karbonis is totally esoteric. The idea that you bring an animal and there's something holy about it, no one even knows what holiness is. What that means, in other words, is there are parts of Torah that Hashem brought down from heaven to earth in such a way that they came all the way down to the earth. They came down to the earth to such a degree that a goy can understand them, that the Yetzer Hara can understand. They make sense. Other parts of Torah you cannot understand unless you raise yourself up to the level of your neshama and your godliness. And therefore, to a non-Jew, it doesn't make any sense. The 2 areas that are outstanding in this regard are Taharis and Kachim, the laws of pure and impure, and above the laws of pure and impure, the laws of holy. Holy is higher than pure. You go into the same room as a dead body, you become ritually impure. You touch an insect that's dead, you become impure. What did I do? What's the big deal? You have to run to the mikveh, and if you don't run to the mikveh, in many cases, you're Rachmana litzlan chayev misa. Because of what? Because of what? A person is dirty, you take a shower, you're clean. No, it has to be a mikveh. And there's stories in the Chazal how the mikvahs used to smell very bad. So people used to go to the mikveh, and after the mikveh they took a shower, and as a result they were negligent in going to the mikveh. So the Chachamim made a gzeira that mayim she'uvim metam sayadayim, that if a person goes to the mikveh and then he goes and takes a shower in water that was not connected to the ground or rainwater, he becomes tamei again. The clean water makes him tamei. The dirty, smelly water made him tired. How do you make sense out of that? And of course the answer is, doesn't make any sense unless you understand ruchniya, spirituality. And to feel it, you have to be especially spiritual. A person becomes tamei. Does he feel different? His brain is different, his heart is different, his body is different, exactly the same person. To sense, to appreciate Tumah and Tara, you have to be extraordinarily sensitive and spiritual, because it's a spiritual thing, it's not a physical thing, it's not a medical thing, it's a totally ruchnius deke inyan. And Torah can be stacked. Nezikim are the parts of Torah which came down all the way to the level of earth. But a guy can understand them as well. And other parts of Torah are all the way up here, like kacham, like karbanis. The whole idea that a carbon is holy. In the language of mysticism, pure is vessel. Holy is light. Purity is about a pure vessel. Holiness is about light. You shecht an animal in the Beis HaMikdash, and you sprinkle its blood, you put some parts of the animal on his mizbeach, and the kohen sits and eats it, and it's holiness. What happened? What happened? It doesn't look very holy, doesn't feel very holy, but it is holy. But to feel the holiness of a korban, you have to be yourself a very pure person, a very spiritual person. A person who is sensitive sufficiently can sometimes experience the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, which means he's experiencing the oil associated with Madrega of Karbanis. So we look at Tum and Tara as chukim, the laws of Nida, the laws of Palkeri, the laws of Zov and Zova. Zov and Zova, you could say, is a sickness, but even then, why should you become ritually impure? And even the laws of Nevela and Chagovim, and Shratzim, and Tumas Meis, and Tzaras, all of these halachas of Tumah don't make any sense. Because they're not a down-to-earth level of Torah, they're a very heavenly level of Torah. And you have to assume that people who are very, very sensitive can experience the difference between pure and impure on these highest levels, because when you're very, very refined, you're very sensitive to the slightest changes in one's spiritual sensitization, and then you feel what happens when you're in contact with a dead body, or you encounter another kind of tumah. And accordingly, Tzaraas has such a huge section in the Chumash, and also the law, like I said before, Nida and Keri and Zava also have a considerable section in Torah, not as long as Tzaraas, but also quite an elaborate discussion of those halachas of Tumah and Tahara. Because although to you and to me, as we live on this earth, these ideas are so spiritual and so ephemeral and so chukah-like, we have to accept them blindly. But in the world of Atzilus, where Torah Shebiksav is, this is completely logical. It's more logical than the laws of Nezikin even. So we're going to learn a tiny little Maamar about Tzaraas. And what we're going to be learning about this Maamar about Tzaraas is what it means that Tzaraas is an Eilam Atzilus. Tzaraas is a Tumah. It's a spiritual impurity. And the din of a Metzora is that it's nishtala chutz l'shalosh machnes. He has to be alone. He has to be outside the camp. He's not allowed to be next to anybody else. He has to be all by himself. He can't even go into Yerushalayim. Can't even go to Machne Leviyah, Machne Yisrael. He has to be outside the camp completely. And he has to be boded yeshiv, like it says in Sfarim, because he spoke Lashon Hara, which is the basis for Tzaraas, like we learned from Miriam. And therefore he has to be by himself. And at the same time, the whole concept of Tzaraas is so spiritual. Because in the event of Tzaraas, you have the idea of Siv of Nishar HaMeyed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Medayach B'tzadikim K'chut HaShayra. A person who's a Metzora, who's so severely isolated and quarantined, is because he is in such a high madrege that the tiniest deficiency results in the most severe consequence, so that he should be able to purify himself even from this small little lack, this small little flaw and deficiency. So this is the introduction to the Maamar. And if I may summarize, number one, those things in Torah which are discussed at the greatest length are discussed at the greatest length, because in the world where Torah Shebiksav is given, those are the most important in Yonim. And Tzaraas deserves an enormous amount of attention, because Tzaraas is an event of Tum and Tahara for the level of Atzilus. If you're in the world of Atzilus, pure and impure is measured in the finest of all Tumas, which is the Tumah of Tzaraas. And at the same time, when one is found to be Tameh, he has the most severe consequence. He's isolated all by himself and all the way out of the camp, because on this Madrege there is zero tolerance, if you will. So let's begin. Adam ki yiyeh b'yed b'sari. When a person will have in the skin of his flesh a discoloration, a color of white. Now, the question of the Maamar is obvious. Why all of a sudden is this person who is ritually impure called Adam? You may recall that when it says a person doesn't aved, it says nefesh kisechta. Nefesh, a soul that sins. And the Zayar says only nefesh can sin. Ruach cannot sin, neshama cannot sin, chaya cannot sin, and yechida cannot sin. Nefesh is the lowest level of the neshama. It's the only place where sin can take place. And even then the Zayar says nefesh kisechta tva. It doesn't make sense how a person can do an aved. Adam, says the Alter Rebbe, I'm on line 3 now, hu b'madrega gedela, is the highest level. Lefi shehu shleimu dekulu, because he is a perfection and a peacefulness and a wholeness and inclusiveness of all. Human beings have 4 names. Adam, Ish, Enesh, and Gever. Adam means man, Ish means man, Enesh means man, and Gever means man. But first of all, notice the following. For each one of the other 3, there's a masculine and a feminine form. There's Enesh and there's Anusha. That's male and female for Enesh. There's Gever and there's Geveret. That's male and female for Gever. There's Ish and there's Isha. That's male and female for Ish. The female of Adam is Adam. It says explicitly in the Chumash in Parshas Bereshis that Vayikra Shmam Adam b'yemi Baram. When Adam and Chava were created, they were both called Adam. Adam is not male versus female. Adam means human being, both male and female. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, these 4 names of humankind, I believe it's discussed in the Yeyeh, represent 4 levels. And in very short, Adam is Mailas HaSeichel. The word Adam denotes someone whose strength is his mind. Ish is Mailas HaMides. Ish is the strength of emotions. Enesh, the word Enesh denotes weakness, which goes on a sinner. And the word Gever, which shows on extra strength, is the idea of Baal Tshuva. So Adam, Ish, Enesh, and Gever are 4 levels. The Mail of Moichin, the Mail of Midas, the Cholosh, the one who is weak and therefore could sin, and the one who has to compensate for that sin, the Baal Tshuva, which is Gever. So the Rebbe says, you're talking about Tzaraas. Now remember, we're at the beginning of the Maamar. And I, of course, gave you a heads up. I told you what the Maamar is going to say. But if you were learning the Maamar without the introduction, you wouldn't have this background that Tzaraas is a very high level. You would have this question. Why would the Torah begin the Parsha of Tzaraas, which deals with the most severe tum in this prat, with the word Adam? And the Rebbe says, the Madrega Gedela is the highest level. Lefi Shleimu Dekula is the perfection and wholeness of all. Pirish, and the reason for this is Mepneishu Kolol Mikol Abachinas. The word Adam includes all aspects. There's a famous medrash on the word Adam, which says that the meaning of Adam is that he's min ha'yenim and min ha'tachtenim. The word Adam means he's from the highest of the high to the lowest of the low. First of all, chesed ugvura v'rachamim, that laterally, from right to left, so to speak. He's the right side, the left side, and the center, kindness, severity, and compassion. V'chol ha'midas v'hanhagis, in all measures, in all aspects of governance, hashayachis, that are related, b'misha hu shalat umesha be'elam, and the one who controls his world, namely the Eibishter, are included in the word Adam. When you call a person Adam, you're saying that he's shleimas hamidas. That means he has chesed, gevura, and teferes. And he's shleimas Adam because he has moichin and mides and also nehi. Right, left, center, top, middle, bottom. Adam is a complete human being. A complete human being means someone who's very, very whole and very, very, very deep and very, very down to earth. Those 3 things are usually not together. Whole means he has a whole diversity of different experiences. Deep means he has a connection to what is above form. And down to earth is that he translates all of his form and all of his depth into action, into Maisa B'Peil. Only Adam has those combinations. And I'll say tangentially, parenthetically, I remember reading that Over the years, different people, graphologists, that means experts on handwriting, analyzed the handwritings of several of our Rabbeim, of the Alter Rebbe, and I believe there's an analysis also of the handwriting of the Rebbe Marash. And I remember reading, I think it was about the Rebbe Marash's handwriting, but it may have been the Alter Rebbe, where the person who analyzed the handwriting said of the Rebbe Marash that he was a very, very, very sophisticated person, a very, very fearless person. He was very, very in control of his environment. His mind was in the loftiest of realms, and at the same time was extraordinarily pragmatic, was extraordinarily down to earth. Usually you're either high or low. To be both high and low means that you're higher than high, and therefore there's no difference between hamagbihi lashaves, hamishpil l'reis b'shamayim of others. There's no difference in high and low. That's what the word Adam suggests. Adam represents wholeness. The most sophisticated human being, who has his head in the clouds and his feet planted firmly on the ground, is called Adam. And he continues, as opposed to people, which is most of us, who find themselves to be specialists. They're very good at one aspect, or two aspects, rather than being whole and comprehensive. Then you would not call them Adam, you would call them by a lesser name. If they're weak, you would call them Enesh. If they're compensating for weakness, you would call them Gever. If they're whole, but partial, you would call them Ish. And he makes a very, very uncomfortable reference. Moshe Rabbeinu was called Ish. And he says that Afal Pi, notwithstanding, Moshe is such a high level. Nevertheless, Adam is higher than him. This happens to be a sikh on the Likutei Torah, where he explains at length why Moshe Rabbeinu is called Ish and not Adam, because of there's a mile of midas of a meichin. But in this mile it says Ish means you have one strength, or two strengths. Adam means you have every strength. So when you want to talk about a human being who is susceptible, who is vulnerable to a tumah, a severe tzaras, you would think it would make sense that you should choose an illusion which we define human beings as so lowly, so deficient, so compromised that they can fall into such a tumah, and instead the Torah says other. Why is it? I skipped the small type. Why is it that Adam on such a high level, that a Yeyeh kol ha'advarim b'chuli, he includes every faculty and every aspect, whether it's intellect or it's emotion or it's music or it's dance or it's art. There's nothing that's not included in him. He's able to ascend upwards in his ideas and in his actions, and at the same time, and they come to the lowest levels. And such a human being, a mensch, a adam, the whole world depends upon him, because he's complete. He's the whole world. He is the whole world. Each one of us is a piece of a puzzle. Adam is the entire puzzle. So of course the question becomes, or the idea is, when does the person get tzaraas if he's an adam? If you're wondering why you've never seen anybody that has the biblical version of tzaraas, as opposed to the disease that they currently call leprosy, it's because in order to have tzaraas, you have to be a neshama datzilis. You have to be an adam, higher than Ish. And when you read this ma'amar for face value, that means even higher than the madrega of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is of course very difficult to understand, but that's what it says in Pshat. So the Rebbe now continues on line 13, and he says, V'hine, Adam hazeh, when a person is this whole, when all of his actions are kosher, and he corrected all things and all aspects as they exist on high, meaning to say this mensch, this Adam, engaged in all the entanglements, all the sparks that are trapped in klipa, and he disentangled them, and he separated the klipa from the kedusha. And he brought the Kedusha closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when he raised it up. He was mevared everything. He disentangled all the disorder and created a healthy and a healed order, which makes him not only a perfect person, but a person who brings perfection to the world. All of a sudden there's a possibility that Yuchali is a dayin. It's conceivable that such a human being should find himself that be'er b'sari, in the skin, which is above his flesh. In other words, the most peripheral, the most external aspects of him, the evil and the waste has not been cleansed and refined from him. Now, the way this is explained in spiritual terms, in psychological terms, it's the idea of nichve mechopase shel chaveri. That means sometimes the person is very frum, very intense, a kanoi. And people who meet intense people feel discouraged, they feel pushed away, they feel discredited, they feel insulted, they feel second class. And the person who's passionate and very intense in Yiddishkeit doesn't mean to do it. Simply the intensity of his avodah creates a fire that those around him are singed, are burned by it. And that's considered a flaw. Because ideally, the person who's on such a high madrega should mask his intensity to such a degree that someone outside shouldn't see it at all. So it's a chassaron. If a person is very, very intensely involved in Avodas Hashem, but as a consequence of that intense involvement in Avodas Hashem, he burns somebody else, then that intensity has an element of deficiency, of chitzonius, a lack that needs to be healed. And I'll share with you two stories, or a story and a word. One of the stories is there was we all know that the Alter Rebbe had a Talmud. The Beis Rebbe calls him a Talmud. Rabbi Aaron Alevi Horowitz Mistrashel, Rabban Strasheler, who became an Admur, he became a Guterid after the Alter Rebbe passed away, was nostalgic. We also know from documents and so forth, this was against the Alter Rebbe's wishes. But Rabban Strasheler was a Godel Shebegdem. The previous Rebbe calls him a Rav Gon, Rav Chassid, Rav Kodesh, Rav Gon, Rav Tzadik, but nicht Rebbe. Rebbe he wasn't. He was a very great man. And he had a whole following. After the Alter Rebbe passed away, he was direct competition to the Mittel Rebbe. And there's a whole larichas which is not for now. So the story is that a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, I'm not going to say the name of the chassid because I think there's contradictions, and I believe in the Rishimis it says a different name than the one I read in other places. In the Rebbe's Rishimis, the story is told. Who became a chassid of the Mittel Rebbe, who decided to visit Strashel and check out his old friend. Rabban Strashel was a Talmud of the Alter Rebbe's. This was a chassid who was also by the Alter Rebbe. He went over to the Mittel Rebbe. He wanted to see what the Mittel Rebbe's competitor is up to. Now the Mittel Rebbe and Strashel were very different in their style. When the Mittel Rebbe said Chassidus, and in general when the Mittel Rebbe did anything, he was like a marble statue, a bullets. You saw nothing on the outside. He stood still. And inside there was a fire, a cauldron. The Rebbe once by Ferengen described, and he actually made with his hands, he wore a pointy streimel, and for the tip of the streimel, sweat would pour like a fountain when he would meditate and concentrate. And his body was motionless, showed no tnuah. Rabban Strasheler was an incredibly passionate man who was very, very, very demonstrative, and he had an incredible magnetism. People were drawn to him like flies to a light. So this chassid of the Alter Rebbe went to Strasheler, and he stood as Rabban Strasheler, his former friend, and now a Guterid, competitor of the Mittel Rebbe, was saying Chassidus. And he was very, very impassioned. So when he started the Maamar off, he spoke softly. But as he talked, he got more and more excited and aroused, until eventually he got so excited he stood up, and he was swinging with his hands. And this friend of his sees that Rabban Strashel doesn't even realize that he stood up. He still thinks he's sitting. In other words, he's in another planet. Then he got excited even more. He stood up on the chair. And eventually he was standing on the table, swinging both of his hands and screaming the Maamar Chassidus. And this chassid saw that Rabban Strashel, this is not chitzay, this is not a bluff, this is not an act. He has no idea where he is. He's just so in another world that his body is, so to speak, running away with the Maamar. But as the Maamar was finishing, Rabban Strashel started to come down. And eventually Rabban Strashel realized that he's not sitting, he's standing. And he's not standing on the floor, he's not standing on the chair, he's standing on the table. And he made a split-second decision that he should stay on the table till he finishes, he almost finished, till he finishes the Maamar. His former friend noticed that instant when Rabban Strashel noticed that he's standing on the table. And Rabban Strashel made the decision to stay on the table, and there was a voice from the back of the room, Arke, kriech up from Tish. Aaron, get off the table. So long as you were not aware that you're standing on the table, that was Chassidus. Now it's Chitzenius. That's an example of Tzaraas, a person whose passion for the Eibishter is so strong. If there's a Chitzorin that's skin deep on the surface, you get Tzaraas. But if it's deeper than the skin deep, you don't get Tzaraas. It's only when it's only on the surface. That's the first story that I wanted to share. And the second is a word from Rabbi Nanas. It's really very interesting. Rabbi Nanas spent close to 20 years in Russian prisons. When he came out of jail in the mid-60s, 66 I think, the Rebbe asked him to write his autobiography, which was published under the pseudonym Avraham Netzach. And the name of the book is Subbotu, because he didn't work Shabbos, and Subbotu means one who doesn't work, it means Shabbos. Some 30 years later, I figure, 25 years later, the book was reprinted in Hebrew, a translation from the Yiddish, with a much better layout, much easier to read, under the title Ha'ish Shalei Nichna, and now it's officially his. It says his name. Leizer Nanas no longer says a pseudonym of Ram Netzach, it says his actual name. Now, as a child, I read Subbotu, and as a married man, when the reprint came out, I read it again. And they added additional pages and notes and stories that he had written after he wrote the book, Subbotu, under the pseudonym of Ram Netzach. And in the section of the autobiography, which is added in the second edition, of the Hebrew edition, which you don't have in the Yiddish edition, he also describes what happened to him after he left Russia. And he lived almost 35 more years after he left Russia. He passed away, I think, in 1999. He came out of Russia probably in 1966. One of the stories he tells is very interesting. He passed away at 99 years old. So when he came out of Russia, he was in his 60s. And you spent 20 years in the Soviet Gulag, you're like 160 years old. He didn't think he's going to live very long. So when he came here, he came to the Rebbe, he told the Rebbe he wants to be by the Rebbe because he's an old man. He's lived his life, he's suffered his sufferings, now he wants to be next to the Rebbe until he dies. And the Rebbe said, I want you to go back to Eretz Yisrael and live in Yerushalayim. And he resisted. He wanted to stay by the Rebbe. And the Rebbe very powerfully, very forcefully said to him that a soldier goes where his general tells him to go and not where he wishes to go. And Leizer Nanas adds a commentary. The commentary is when the Rebbe told him those words, he says, I never heard a Rebbe talk with such force since I heard the previous Rebbe Fabreng during the lifetime of the Rashab. I never heard a Rebbe, as a Rebbe, speak with such taikif since I heard the previous Rebbe speak at Fabrengenishin when he wasn't yet the Rebbe, when his father was the Rebbe. That's the quote from the Sefer. The meaning of the quote is that the Leizer Nanas understands that tzaddikim mask, they hold back the fire. Because if we would see the fire inside a tzaddik, we'd all get burned, we'd all run away. So it's very, 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 around him it's warm, it's not hot, because he contains the fire. And even though inside there's an incredibly intense fire, on the outside, it's managed in such a way that an ordinary person, a Nashim Kerkenu, could be there and not get burned. Something that Abba Strashela couldn't do. So he said that when the Rebbe said that statement to him, and that a soldier goes where his general tells him, not where he wants to go, he said the power with which the Rebbe said it was so urgent, it was like he remembers the previous Rebbe's power when he was Fabrenging, when he wasn't yet that Rebbe, because once he was a Rebbe, he so to speak, toned down, he tempered his Fabrengings, not to burn people. And those are the two sides of Tzaraas. The biggest tzaddikim, when they're so intense that they burn the people around themselves, that's the basis for Tzaraas. And tzaddikim who are even bigger, as intense as the fire is on the outside, the expression in Yiddish is kalten brand, kalten fire, inside is fire and outside is ice. And that's the meaning of Tzaraas, And of course, that's the explanation for why, when it comes to Tzaraas, it says the word Adam. It explains why the Torah spends so much time about Tzaraas. It explains why Tzaraas is so unknown and so infrequent to us, because it's for Neshamas of Atzilus, to the biggest people. Why is it such a big discussion in Torah? Because Torah Shebiksav Chumash is Torah Atzilus. And the Rebbe says, line 16, V'nei Lodim, and a person who's perfect on the inside, and his flaw is only superficial and skin deep, in him is born Simonim Begashmius indicators, signs on his skin. Bibsari, on the skin, not in the flesh, but on the skin. Shalei Kederach HaTeva, which is higher than nature. Veheim HaNagoyim, which is what Tzaraas is, what leprosy is in Torah. Now from here you get the impression there's three basic categories of Tzaraas. There's Tzaraas in the body of a person, there's Tzaraas in the clothing of a person, and there's Tzaraas in homes. When you read the Rambam in Perek Zayin of Hilchas Negoyim, the end of Hilchas Tzaraas, clearly he holds that the Tzaraas in the homes was a moifis, was a pele, was shlei piteva. But Tzaraas on the skin, it's not clear what the Rambam holds. You can read the Rambam both ways. The Alter Rebbe is going to quote that Rambam momentarily. And the Alter Rebbe makes it very clear that he holds that all of Tzaraas, including Tzaraas on the skin, was not a natural disease, as some people interpret it. It was a Maisa Pele. You can't call it a miracle because it's a miracle with a negative aspect, but it was a Oisu Pele, it was a sign and a wonder. It has no place within the biological nature of people, of human beings. And the basis for Tzaraas is some kind of a leichus, whatever that means, an atmospheric effect, an effect in the atmosphere, that causes these diseases, these skin rashes, to appear on the surface of a person's skin. The Rambam writes, this is, of course, in the last Perek Hilchas Tzaraas, in Yad HaChazaka, Shemitzvahs Nagoyim Einei Nohog Bizmanei, the mitzvahs of Tzaraas, because the mitzias, the reality of leprosy, is not found in our days. After the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Now you would think that if in the time of the Beis HaMikdash people were tamei, in the time of Gauls they're tamei more, and here you're saying no. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash they had this severe tumah, and now we don't have this severe tumah. What's the logic? And the answer is because this severe tumah is a severe tumah that happens to severely holy people who have the smallest deficiencies on the surface of their being. That's when they become Metzora. Because it's very, very unlikely. Nowadays, that there should be a change in the flesh itself without any effect in the atmosphere. Because it's like the apparent of a brightness, like the sun, which is automatically deeper than the shade and so forth. And therefore the Rambam holds that this phenomenon of having a deficiency that's only skin deep and not in the flesh, that is beneath the skin, only on the surface, was a miracle. And this miracle happened to people who were on such a high level that their avodas Hashem, chisreines, would show themselves in their physical body as this ailment. We all do things that are wrong. But if we were immediately punished for the things that we did wrong, we'd all be walking around blind and crippled and maimed. It doesn't work that way. We have chesreinus, we have to fix. A tzaddik on the highest madrege, when he has an avodas Hashem flaw, feels it in his body. But only a tzaddik with such a high madrege, where the flaw is only superficial, because if the flaw is any greater depth, it's not going to show itself in his body. Only a tzaddik who's so perfect that his deficiencies are only superficial, skin deep, sees the aveda on his skin. But it's only on his skin. Because you're talking about a person who spiritually and in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Tikein b'maisav, has made perfect all of his deeds. Which means to say his Torah and mitzvahs, which are kedusha, are perfect. In addition, Obiter Ramanatev, he separated evil from good, and he organized, and he gave order to the chaos, b'chol advarim, in every aspect of his piece of this world. Rak pseles shebeseif levushim. There remains a deficiency only on the lowest level of his garbage. That means on the very outside of his personality. That's only to the other people, to the outside. that Adayin Lane is batter, which is not yet made clear. They show itself on his skin. The Alter Rebbe keeps using the word basar, but lachei means the union of oyer. Basar means the meat, and oyer means the skin. And this is about the skin. And if you have any depth to your chesrenis, you're not going to see anything. And only when the chesrenis are totally on the surface will you see the chesed. So first of all, says the Alter Rebbe, it's an incredible madrege to be zoichet to negoyim. You have to be an adam who's perfect otherwise. And when the chesed is only outside, you become a menuga. Now I want to point out here, and I want to mention that when the Rebbe started the campaign about Mashiach, which is 24 years ago, this time of year, right after Pesach, Tafshin and Aleph, the Sikha that laid the foundation for the whole Mashiach campaign was the Sikha of Tazria Metzora. And that Sikha talked about this topic that our Maamar is talking about. And the Rebbe brought the Gemara about Mashiach. That the Gemara says, who is Mashiach? That he's a chivri, he's a leper who sits in the gates of Rome. And the Rebbe connected it to the Gemara, where the Gemara says, Im min chayek beina beina kodesh, and Rashi says, Chosid gomer hoya v'chesevel tachaluim. That what's the sign of Mashiach? That he is perfect, and nevertheless he suffers because of the sins of those around him. In other words, inside he's perfect, and the chesrenis, he suffers so much because of the suffering, because of the chesrenis of other people. And if I recall correctly, in that sikha, the Rebbe suggested that Mashiach is a menuga not because he has a chesaron b'seif levushav. Mashiach is perfect. He's a menuga because the yidden around him have a chesaron b'seif levushav. But be that as it may, that's the concept of tzaraas. Only a person who's virtually perfect can get this tumah. Otherwise, in quotes, you're not zoiche, end quote, to get this tumah. And there's another side to this. In addition to everything we said until now, that tzaraas is a symptom. It's a disease. It's an illness, which is a pelo ois, that happens to people who are perfect besides for their periphery. Says the Alter Rebbe, there's another side to it. And that is that negoyim dvarim gveinim. This concept of this illness called tzaraas has an alternative perspective, has a high level. And from the higher level, it isn't a disease at all. And I don't have time to be ma'irech in it, but I believe, I'm not wrong, in Hem Shchaim Beis, the Rebbe Rashab has 2 prakim about tzaraas, or 1 perek about tzaraas, and he talks about the difference of how you understand tzaraas in Biyah, and how you understand tzaraas in Atzilus. And in Biyah it's Iyuf and Tumah, and Atzilus it's a high level of Kedusha. And that's what the Rebbe explains. He says, Sheini nikra Tama shakenu akein Tama. First of all, when a person has this discoloration, he's not Tama even though he's showing the symptoms. The Kohen has to say Tama, and he becomes Tama because of the Kohen's words, not because of the coloration. A person has tzaraas, and everybody looks at it, sees him and says, he's not Tama. He's Tahir. And when the Kohen makes him Tameh, he's only Tameh v'kano la'aba. The Tumah is not retroactive. It doesn't make things Tameh yesterday. Because it's not that the Kohen identifies the Tumah, the Kohen creates the Tumah. So the white discoloration on the surface, which is a sign that he only has a deficiency in the most outer levels, before the Kohen says Tameh, is also not a chasar. It's a from Kedusha. And so long as the Kohen is not declared to be ritually unfit, ein an negoyim b'chlal Tumah. They're not a tumah at all, but to the contrary, the very same experience, the color white represents something which is higher than the other colors. It's supernal lights. But the advantage of the color white, which represents a very, very high level of revelation, as it is in the Metzora before it becomes tummy, is gevura. It's like everything else. When you have too much, it's also not good. And the Rebbe says on line 30, then he comes to the Kohen who's Aaron. And Aaron HaKohen, first of all, says, Tameh, Yikri, makes him Tameh, and he isolates him, and so forth and so on. And then, just like he becomes Tameh, not because the coloration appeared in his skin, but because the Kohen called him Tameh, he does not become Tahir because the coloration departed from his skin, but because the Kohen says that he's Tahir. He comes to the Kohen Aaron, and the Kohen raises him up and heals him. Because the Kohen is supernal kindness, the Yeyeh, the right side. And therefore the Kohen can make sweet judgment. And when he says pure, this superficial deficiency, which on the one hand is in a perfect person. On the other hand, it's a very severe tumah, becomes pure, where they become transformed into absolute good. Line 33, there's certain of these blemishes which even the kohen cannot cure because they're from too high a level, but most negoyim the kohen could cure. So the Rebbe finishes the Maamar. Once you understand this, you understand that the Torah is not speaking nonsense, but rather the Torah is in a different world and from a different perspective. And in the world of the Torah, and from the perspective of the Torah, nothing more deserves more time and attention than Tzaraas, because it's speaking to a person that's on the level of Torah Shebeksav, which is the world of Atzilus. And the Rebbe includes the Maamar in line 34. The phenomenon of leprosy is not applied, is not enacted nowadays. People don't get the disease. Because getting the disease of Tzaraas is made him shows. A person who's made clear the evil that's inside his body and his soul, absolutely. And only the outer level of the nefesh, there's a deficiency. And for a person to be in such a high madrega that inside he's perfect, and the chesron on the outside is virtually non-existent. Because in our times people don't exist like this, because even the righteous and the good, the evil exists on an internal level a little bit for Kal, and therefore Tzaraas doesn't occur, because Tzaraas only happens to a person who has a chesron, and the chesron is only on the outermost levels. And of course there's an obvious message. Besides for the message of Lashon Hara and so on, there is the message of refinement. A lot of people do good things, but on their outside they're very rough around the edges. And Tzaraas is teaching you that if a person is rough around the edges, it's a simon, there's a deficiency in the pnimius. And in terms of midas tevis and soft-spokenness and being deliberate and patient, these are midas which have to do with the chitzonius of a person. But those chitzonius show on the pnimius sheba pnimius. When a person is also beautiful on the outside, that means he's extra beautiful on the inside as well. And again, we're learning this Maamar this week, even though it's Shmini and B'li Neder. Next week we're going to start Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach, the Maamar V'nigdashti.